Although the relationship between Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark only lays part of the groundwork for the contemporary storyline in A Song of Ice and Fire, the fan interpretation of their story typically leans towards the two of them having a star-crossed love affair that resulted in a cataclysmic event in Westerosi history. And understandably, the portrayal of their marriage in Game of Thrones only bolstered this assumption even further. However, in terms of the actual storytelling within A Song of Ice and Fire, the notion of Lyanna and Rhaegar as an alternate universe Romeo and Juliet really doesn't make sense. Given that Lyanna and Rhaegar seem to fit the picture-perfect definition of a doomed love affair in Game of Thrones, it's certainly understandable why so many viewers and readers think that Lyanna Stark's love was the catalyst for the end of the Targaryen dynasty and the beginning of the Baratheon reign. But relying on Game of Thrones to portray an accurate depiction of their relationship is likely a mistake. Game of Thrones has always shied away from presenting its more likable characters in a remotely morally ambiguous way in the first place. And considering that Rhaegar and Lyanna's marriage, and resulting child, was used almost entirely as a plot point to drive Daenerys to violence, it seems safe to say that they likely simplified Rhaegar and Lyanna's story as much as they possibly could for the sake of saving time, and not forcing the audience to ask any uncomfortable questions. And clearly, the fact that they so obviously aged Lyanna up, in comparison to her book counterpart, seems to indicate that they were unwilling to even hint at any of the ickier aspects of the entire situation. Clearly, Rhaegar and Lyanna in Game of Thrones gives fans of the relationship a lot of positive evidence in their corner. However, it actually seems quite likely that their brief storyline in the show was merely an interpretation or educated guess on the part of the Game of Thrones writers, while in reality, Rhaegar and Lyanna's saga is not a love story in the slightest. There are a lot of potential hints that Rhaegar and Lyanna's romance might be much darker than many readers want to assume, and one of the biggest is simply George R.R. Martin's writing style. A Song of Ice and Fire is one of the most complex novel series ever written. But with that in consideration, the story itself is actually astoundingly lacking in genuine romance stories. Healthy, romantic love is something that's barely ever portrayed in A Song of Ice and Fire. And even the characters who believe that they're in love with someone else are often a part of an obviously toxic relationship, or they have feelings that are completely unrequited. Ned and Kat are arguably the healthiest romance in the series, but their relationship is anything but the wild, impulsive, and passionate affair that most fans imagine Rhaegar and Lyanna's love to be. Not to mention, Ned and Kat's love is simply an aspect of this fictional world that exists when the story begins. Their love really isn't its own story, it's a facet of the reality that all of these characters already live in. Ultimately, sincere romantic love stories just aren't a significant part of the world of Ice and Fire. And while it's not impossible that Rhaegar and Lyanna's true love is just meant to be yet another facet of world building, thematically, that notion just doesn't make much sense. Because, in contrast to the lack of love stories in A Song of Ice and Fire, there are an astounding number of instances where younger and more naive characters are manipulated and used as pawns for whatever grand plans an older, more informed, and more experienced character has in store. And while this is something that applies to nearly every young character in the story, it's a particularly strong theme when it comes to the Starks. So, if past really is prologue, then it actually seems considerably more likely that Lyanna was being manipulated by Rhaegar, not that she was madly in love with him. And, although both Rhaegar and Lyanna have gotten barely any character development within the contemporary storyline, everything that the books tell us about both of them seemingly backs up that notion. The first and most obvious indication that this wasn't some love affair gone wild is what the books tell us about Lyanna Stark. If Lyanna wanted to escape her betrothal with Robert because she believed he would be unfaithful, then it makes absolutely no sense that she'd run off with a married man who had 2 children, even if she liked the songs he sang. And, While this can only be inferred based on what we know about the Starks in general, considering that they're a family who seems very humble and difficult to impress, it also seems unlikely that Lyanna was the type of girl who would swoon over a Targaryen prince because he was rich and pretty. Even more interestingly, one of the few direct quotes that we have from Lyanna indicates that she wouldn't have run off with Rhaegar. When Lyanna shows misgivings about Robert, Ned tries to convince her that a match with Robert would end well for her because Robert was good and true and would love her with all his heart. And in response, she tells him, "Love is sweet, dearest Ned, but it cannot change a man's nature." So again, Lyanna's unstoppable love for Rhaegar doesn't seem to make any sense, because she has directly stated that love isn't enough for her. And fans of Rhaegar might try to argue that his exceptional nature is exactly what drew Lyanna to him in the first place. But putting aside the fanboy and fangirl attitude that so many people in his orbit seem to have towards him, much of what Rhaegar did was incredibly self-centered and destructive, which does not seem like the kind of behavior that would impress even young Lyanna Stark. And while these are only parallels drawn between characters, it's interesting that the most common comparison between Lyanna and any contemporary character is between Lyanna and Arya. And it seems that the connections with these characters is noted for good reason. Ned specifically tells Arya that she reminds him of Lyanna. He also says that Lyanna might have carried a sword if their father had allowed it. And given that Arya is now training to be an assassin, it seems that, at least in one major way, Arya is living the life that Lyanna wished she could have had. Ergo, the notion that Lyanna suddenly threw her desires to the wind because becoming Rhaegar's second wife was so appealing just does not make sense. If the parallels between Arya and Lyanna are meant to be applied to the broad strokes of both of their characters, it seems safe to assume that, like Arya, Lyanna had no real interest in becoming a lady or a queen whose purpose in life is to provide her husband with viable heirs, which is yet another aspect of her characterization that seems to put her in direct conflict with Rhaegar, who we know for a fact was specifically obsessed with creating another heir to fulfill his interpretation of prophecy. And while George R.R. Martin has specifically referred to Rhaegar as love-struck when he first met Lyanna, the actual characterization provided for Rhaegar seems to directly conflict with the idea that he was madly in love with Lyanna as well. Rhaegar is an interesting character because whether someone's vision of him is wonderful or evil, everyone seems to project their own fantasies onto him, rather than seeing him for whatever he truly was. But that doesn't come as much of a surprise either, because those who were physically close to him seem to describe him as someone who had no close relationships with anyone. When telling Daenerys about her brother, Sir Barristan says, "It was said that no man ever knew Prince Rhaegar, truly. I had the privilege of seeing him in tourney, though, and often heard him play his harp with its silver strings." Selmy also says, "The maesters were awed by his wits, but his father's knights would jest sourly that Baelor the Blessed had been born again, until one day, Prince Rhaegar found something in his scrolls that changed him. No one knows what it might have been, only that the boy suddenly appeared early one morning in the yard as the knights were donning their steel. He walked up to Sir Willem Darry, the master-at-arms, and said, 'I will require a sword and armor. It seems I must be a warrior.'" While it's possible that Rhaegar held back from Barristan because of his apparent loyalty to Aerys, that clearly wouldn't apply to Rhaegar when he was just a child. So the fact that Sir Barristan perceived him as an isolated boy who was consumed with prophecy, even when he was a child, seems to be quite telling. And interestingly, despite the fact that Jon Connington is obsessed with Rhaegar, this seems to hold true for him as well. When Rhaegar first comes to Griffin's Roost, he notes the beauty of the land. It's a polite enough comment, but considering how close Jon Connington feels with Rhaegar, this exchange feels very impersonal. And therefore, it's strange that Jon Con remembers it so intensely. And looking into Rhaegar's internal life even further, aside from having seemingly very few bonds with others, the only person he's even mentioned as trusting is Arthur Dayne. Rhaegar is consistently characterized as being melancholy. Many spectators actually associate his infatuation with Lyanna as being driven by his unhappiness with Elia. But Sir Barristan directly states that he doesn't know if Rhaegar even had it in him to be happy. So, if Lyanna was a wild child who had no interest in the typical lady's life and was especially repulsed at the idea of being with a philanderer, and if Rhaegar was a man who had no real personal relationships with anyone and seemed to be inherently unhappy, how would the meeting of these two characters result in a whirlwind love affair that was so intense and unstoppable that it literally tore the world apart? On their own, it seems like Rhaegar and Lyanna are naturally a really bad match. But there are quite a few context clues to indicate that their relationship wasn't loving and happy either. One of the most obvious hurdles to the idea of their romance is simply that if Rhaegar and Lyanna were in love, why didn't they get married on the up and up? Sure, it would have been inappropriate and a huge breach of protocol, but there is a precedent for Targaryens having plural marriages. And if Rhaegar and Lyanna both wanted to be wed, then they could have gotten married on the sly, but then come out as a couple when it was too late for anyone to do anything about it. Sure, it wouldn't be ideal, but it likely wouldn't cause a civil war either. And that is a question that persists throughout the course of Robert's rebellion. If Lyanna were a consenting and willing participant in this union, and if she were able to make her own choices, then why didn't she ever do anything to stop what was happening? And why did she spend the remainder of her life in Dorne, alone, and on the other side of the planet from where she told Ned she wanted to return? It's very interesting that Arthur Dayne is noted as the one Rhaegar trusted the most as well, because he is in Dorne guarding Lyanna, and he, Ned, and Hallan Reed wind up fighting to the death. But the bigger question is, why? Why would Arthur want to keep Ned from Lyanna? And why would he be willing to literally kill Ned if he's supposedly looking after Lyanna's interests? It seems safe to assume that the prophecy-obsessed Rhaegar would have shared his beliefs with the people closest to him. And it also seems safe to assume that he wouldn't have been close to anyone who thought that his ideas were batshit crazy. So, while it tracks that Rhaegar might trust only someone like Arthur Dayne to protect what he believes is at least one head of the Targaryen dragon, and is at most the savior of all mankind, it doesn't necessarily follow that Lyanna believes this prophecy as well, or is a willing participant in whatever is happening now. And that lends itself to a broader question about Rhaegar and Lyanna's relationship. Because Rhaegar believes with every fiber of his being that this prophecy is true, and he is the one who needs to make it come to pass. So in an ideal world, Lyanna would believe it too, and agree to help him. But frankly, his beliefs are bonkers. And with that under consideration, the question then becomes, in an ideal world, Lyanna would consent to this whole scenario. But if she didn't, would that stop Rhaegar? The obvious answer there seems to be no. If Rhaegar was willing to let the entire realm devolve into chaos because of his belief in his own prophetic interpretation, it seems unlikely that the beliefs or choices of one girl would stop him from doing what he thinks needs to be done. But if the old adage that everyone has their own point of view, and the truth is typically somewhere in the middle, holds true, then Rhaegar is likely not the violent abductor, nor the gallant Prince Charming. And his relationship with Lyanna was likely forged on deception rather than outright force. The older and deceptive person manipulating the younger and more naive character is such a baked-in aspect of the world of Ice and Fire that it's actually a part of the in-world lore in the form of the legend of Bael the Bard. Bael the Bard was a king beyond the wall who came to Winterfell and sung songs so beautifully that Lord Stark asked Bael what he wanted as a reward, and the Bard responded that he wanted the most beautiful rose in Winterfell. Lord Stark presented him with a blue winter rose, but the next day saw that his only maiden daughter had disappeared, and the blue rose was left in her bed. Bael and the maiden could not be found, until Lord Stark's daughter returned with a child of her own. She and Bael the Bard had been hiding in the Winterfell crypts all along, and she had his illegitimate child while they were hiding in plain sight. It's actually astounding how many similarities there are between the story of Bael and the Maiden and the story of Rhaegar and Lyanna. But what actually makes this legend seem particularly telling is Rhaegar, his beliefs about himself, and his beliefs about the world in general. Not much is known about Rhaegar personally, but one thing that seems to be incredibly obvious is that he is the dictionary definition of main character syndrome. Obviously, this is an issue with nearly every Targaryen in the story, but it's hard to imagine a person who is more convinced of their own importance in the world than Rhaegar Targaryen. He can literally read a prophecy and believe that he is the lone hero meant to save the world. Or if he's not, then he's destined to bring that hero into the world. But it's extremely easy to envision a world where Rhaegar once again sees himself as the main character of a story. And when he decides that Lyanna Stark is the girl who's destined to give him his third head of the dragon, he can rationalize his actions and mold his behaviors around the fabled Bael the Bard. Interestingly, Ygritte even tells Jon that a bard's truth is different than yours or mine. And given what a renowned singer Rhaegar seems to be, it's not hard to imagine that he also stretched the truth in order to get what he thought was necessary. So, rather than seizing Lyanna by force, like Robert believed he did, and rather than telling Lyanna the truth, which is something that she almost certainly would never have agreed to, he engaged in some charming and trickery to bamboozle Lyanna into what he believes needs to happen. And, by the time that Lyanna realized the danger she was in and what Rhaegar was truly after, it was already too late and she was on the other side of the country being guarded by the few men in the world who actually believed what Rhaegar did too. Rhaegar may have offered Lyanna a way out of her unwanted betrothal with Robert, but she almost certainly didn't know the potential price of that escape, while Rhaegar did. Putting aside the fact that Lyanna was too young to understand what could happen and to consent to that possibility, it seems obvious that she would have never put her family in mortal danger because she didn't want to be with Robert or because she desperately wanted to be with Rhaegar. And Rhaegar did know how dangerous his father was. So it's fundamentally difficult to imagine a scenario in which Rhaegar didn't have to engage in some sort of misleading or misdirection in order to get Lyanna where he needed her to be. Ultimately, it's not yet clear what the nature of Rhaegar and Lyanna's relationship truly was. But the individual characterizations of both characters doesn't mesh well with the notion that they just fell in love, and disastrous consequences sprung from that. Nor does that type of storyline gel well with the rest of A Song of Ice and Fire. However, regardless of what's revealed or how things end up, it seems almost certain that the story of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen is not a love story. But what do you think? Was Rhaegar and Lyanna's relationship true love? Or was it something else? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.